Welcome to Jerusalem Unplugged, the only podcast dedicated to Jerusalem, its history, and its people. Your host, Roberto Mazza, will bring you guests discussing their relationship with the Holy City. A journey through history, society, feelings, and hopes for the future. Follow the podcast on all social media platforms at Jerusalem Unplugged.
Welcome to Jerusalem Unplugged, the podcast dedicated to Jerusalem, its history, and its people. I'm your host, Roberto Mazza, and today it's with great pleasure that my guest is Professor Karene Sanchez. Karene has been a friend for a long time, but here in this context, she's an associate professor at the University of Leiden in the Netherlands, and it's going to take me some time to actually say all of the areas into which she's an expert of. Arab Christianity, European missionaries in the Middle East, and certainly in Palestine and Jerusalem, history of contemporary Middle East, linguistics, minorities, and of course, Jerusalem and Palestine. Now, if you ever browse our website, the list of publication is vast. So I just want to focus on a few because I think they're very important and particularly relevant to the question of Jerusalem and Palestine. And one is an edited work by Karene and Sari Zananariri, who was a previous guest of the podcast, Imaging and Imagining Palestine, Photography, Modernity, and Biblical Lens, 1918-1948, which is published by Leiden, is open access. And as well, another edited work, again by Karene and Sari, European Cultural Diplomacy and Arab Christians in Palestine, 1918-1948. And I'm happy to say that I contributed with a chapter on Italian cultural diplomacy. Now, many of the other articles are really dealing with the question of languages and religious institutions, mostly Christians and Catholic institutions in Palestine and Jerusalem. Now, after this introduction, Karene, welcome.
Thank you very much, Roberto, for welcoming me.
Karene, the first question I have is, given you're a polyglot and you have so many interests in the Middle East and in history, I was wondering, how did you get to work on Palestine and Jerusalem?
That's a very long story, but to answer quickly today, I would say, I think it's a Madeleine of Proust for me. I was visiting Jerusalem when I was young, with my parents, and then they divorced. So I think this marked me. And we were staying in the old city in the neighborhood of Bab Hotta. So I think I took back with me this image. And when I decided to study at the university, I never thought I would become historian, but I was always very interested by languages. I was living with my grandparents in the south of France, Rivesaltes, not very far away from the camp, the Rivesaltes. And I had some friends who came from Algeria. And so talking with them about this language, I hesitated between medicine, neurology, and history. And I ended up doing history. And then I met wonderful professors in Montpellier who pushed me in the direction of Middle Eastern studies. And so I wanted to, of course, learn Arabic better than what I knew a little bit. And then they pushed me to learn Hebrew. And so I decided to go back when I was 17 and then 18. And every year I went back. I always went to the old city, mainly around Bab Hotta, but then also near the new gate, I rented. And so I think I was then attracted, I think, by languages, that's for sure, but also many layers to understand the relational history, I think. And so I took on, PhD trajectory with Nadine Picodou in Sorbonne at that time. My idea was to work on urban space. So my approach of Jerusalem is also coming from my knowledge of Hebron, actually, and Khalil, because my first PhD with Nadine, and then I she had a health issue, and then I moved on with Bernard Héberger, dealt with missionary studies and the challenges of a relational history of missionaries in the district of Hebron during the British Mandate. So this was the first PhD, and of course I had to deal with the linguistic issue, humanitarianism, schooling, but of course I was very much interested by the OCAF archives. And so I lived in Hebron during several months and so years, because I was based both in Jerusalem and Hebron. So for me, the relational paradigm, but also the regional one, was very important from the very beginning. And then I opened up working in the Nablus archives as well. So I would say my approach to Jerusalem was first regional and always relational. But of course, I think I was there 2002 when I stayed several years until 2006. And so it was in the middle of the second Intifada. So it was a very tense situation. So my Jerusalem is a Jerusalem, on a very micro level around Bab Hutta and the New Gate, for example. But it's also revisiting all these places via the narratives of people I was living with. So to give you one example, I spent several months with Regina Canetti. So it's the cousin of Elias Canetti. She is a sister of Zayan's sister, and she introduced me to another sister, and we spent many weeks in the archives together speaking. And so of course, I saw the neighborhood and Bab Hutta also through their eyes. And we discussed all levels, different scales in the neighborhood during the mandate and then during the 67 war. But I think I can say, to conclude with your difficult question, because I think I don't have one perception of Jerusalem. I have many. I think I very much identify with Jerusalem, and I'm living in the Netherlands since many years, I think 16 years now, 15. There's only one city I miss, and it's Jerusalem. I don't miss any other place. And I have to add, of course, I also missed Hebron. So both are linked in my mind, my perception, my living as an historian there. And it's only since COVID that I didn't go back every year. So now 2 years and a half.
I guess many people would be surprised to hear that you missed Jerusalem and Hebron, two very complex and complicated cities, compared to Leiden, which is the image of a very quiet place indeed, where you can bike and walk essentially everywhere. Mm-hmm. You mentioned something very interesting, which is the New Gate. Now, the New Gate, for those who don't know much about the city of Jerusalem, is a tiny little entrance that gives access to the old city, essentially into the Christian quarter, particularly sort of the Catholic area of the Christian quarter. But more importantly, the New Gate is essentially in front of one of the most important French institutions in Jerusalem, which is Notre Dame. And that brings me to ask a question about your very, very early work. When you start writing about the question of languages, and particularly the question of a French language in Palestine and in Jerusalem, as you were looking into educational institutions like Le Collège des Frères de la Salle, or, in general, the question of a competition between languages. So I was wondering if you can just give us a sense which languages were spoken in Jerusalem and Palestine, and how languages competed with each other in this environment.
Yeah, I started with with the question of the language, because working on the first PhD, I was teaching French, and I had many students from Bethlehem. And I realized that these archives in the Collège des Frères were not at all well preserved at that time. And I participated to a project with CNRS on making history, making archives by Christine Jungen. And it was fascinating to work on the material aspect also of archives and how we can write when sometimes we're missing archives in the case of the Palestinian history, but also other types of history in the case of Palestine, Jerusalem. So the question of the cultural diplomacy, I was discussing at that time with Dominique Trambure. So I knew that we knew the political aspect of the presence of France, but in these archives, I was very struck by few homework in Arabic I found with a lot of problems of humidity. And these homework were dealing with the aspect, and they were written in Arabic, but the word came back, la patrie. And I thought to myself, there is something about French. And then I did some oral history for several months. And then a whole history of this college came up via textual archives, but also photographies. And I found out that this linguistic history had not been written as such. So I was, I think, at that time, as interested by how these mainly Arab Palestinians, Muslim and Christians of different groups manage with French, but also how France envisage the presence of all these missionaries at a transnational, regional level within this cultural agenda in Palestine. And so this linguistic battle was, I found out, very harsh between Italian, French, and other, Russian, obviously, before 1917. So what is interesting in this language aspect, in the case of France, it's, of course, this idea of Chrétien d'Orient, so this idea of a public opinion buying the narrative of the protection of the Christians of the Middle East. And I started to deconstruct that on this much disputed zone. And then looking into German archives in German of, for example, the German Archaeological Institute, but also the archives of École Biblique and all these schools that preserve their archives very locally. So they never sent back to France their archives. And because we were in the middle of the Second Intifada, I think there was a need of sharing that from this perspective. So it was a bit easier. I found out that there was not only a cultural diplomacy, in both direction, but also a language diplomacy. So there were demand and offer. And so I started to deconstruct that in this paradigm of a so-called Holy Land. So why the battle was harsh and how this translated on the ground, for France at that time, there's no doubt for the public opinion, Palestine remains, even after the beginning of the British Mandate, they call that in French, the most French land of the Orient. And so starting with that and looking at, top-down archives, let's say, from the consulate, the government, but also a more bottom-up approach with archives from alumni, archives from families Well, and cross-analyzing them with different European archives, both private and official, plus, of course, archives from religious institutions like the Latin Patriarchate, Custodia di Terra Santa. Then we realized that there were a whole agenda via schooling, but also a need of what we could mention as an alter langue. So something that is not English. And at that time, in the archives, we see that Arab Palestinians, for several of them, are qualifying English as the language of occupation, for example. Some of them are not buying the narrative of France being the protector of Christians of the Middle East. Some do. But there is a very emotional load on this in this linguistic battle. So I wanted to deconstruct the value of spreading a language for some of these actors and mastering it and using it, well, for some of them, as we know, to promote, for example, the Arab cause. But once you dig into the language aspect, I would like to give another example of this end of Ottoman Jerusalem. I was reworking recently on Albert Antebi's French archives in Alliance Israélite Universelle. And then you realize how via language, you can tackle the porous boundaries of cultural identification, actually. And so what we see in the IU archives from Albert Antebi is that language is molding his conceptual perception of what is a nation, for example, but also agency. So he is resisting the French in many aspects, and at the same time, he's embodying some of this language of civilization, question mark, of the French. So via language, my idea, and I will finish with that, it was to, I think I can express that this way. I wanted to go beyond a lachrymose history of these Arab Christians from Palestine, but also, in a sense, I think, going beyond this colonial cultural agent from a missionary point of view, and a kind of Vatican narrative, but also a Zionist narrative, for example, in the case of Albert Antebi. Well, it's a bit long, but so to conclude, I would say that the British Mandate period corresponds to a very harsh linguistic battle, where you have on one side French understanding very well they are losing this battle. British who start to understand that they need to invest more in cultural activities, and the British Council will only be open in 1935. I'm now working on an article on that. The idea via language is as ambitious as that, is to bring peace to Palestine. So both of them are looking into a very political approach via language. And then you have, of course, many actors. I mean, if we take, for example, the influence of the Schmidt Schule, so it's a school for girls next to the Damascus Gate. Until today, they enroll many Palestinian girls that are very active. I mean, women involved in Arab Palestinian nationalism also came from the Schmidt Schule. Then you realize that there is also a linguistic agenda with very specific archives, where you see, for example, the Schmidt sisters writing at the beginning of the 30s, even the 20s, actually. German is a forbidden language, of course, after First World War. So they're writing in German and some of them in Kurent, so the very old German. Well, we cannot transmit German, but we have the task to transmit German values that are the values for Arab Christians in Palestine via English language. So digging into language, you have a wide range of identification elements. So I think this is why I was fascinated by this approach.
Ironically, German became the most popular language in one part of Jerusalem after the 1930s, when all of the German Jews eventually migrated to Palestine. So eventually it came back. But I have a question about languages in general. I mean, it's quite clear that in Jerusalem, due to the presence of, obviously during the mandate of British institutions, missionary schools, the Zionist movement growing and bringing people from different countries, I was wondering, is there a sense of how many local Jerusalemites actually spoke a second language? And I guess, as you said earlier, French was declining, and I guess then English was becoming this most spoken second language. But is there a sense if it was a very common feature for people to speak a second and even a third language, or it was only the elites that were engaging with, I don't know, English or French, Italian, and so forth?
So that's a very important question indeed. We cannot measure with exact numbers, but we do have many statistics via, for example, the school system, but also pilgrims or archives linked to pilgrims that are local archives. So bilingualism as such, or diglossia, is not something we find except in many elite families. You have to, if we take several scale, for example, you have elites going through the new neighborhood in Jerusalem, when the middle class and the elite are all mastering at least 2 languages. But the big question is, to what extent do they master one language? With tourism, it's obvious. We know that many from this middle class, but also much lower social milieu, were mastering an easy conversation with tourists. Now, we do not have an accurate, view of what was the type of conversation with these people. With elite, we know. I mean, salons littéraires were very active. People were reading, commenting. If we check even languages we probably do not expect, we know, I mean, with Taufik Kanan, it's obvious, and all the people around the German church, for example, and Sarah worked a lot on that. They had a very good level. They were able to read, to speak, to go to Europe and Germany and to promote some of the events for the Palestinian cause without any problem. With French, it's exactly the same. I mean, I give you a very specific example. In Galilee, there is a bishop, Gregorius Adjar. In the Latin Patriarchate archives, there are many archives, so of course written in Arabic, because we know, the Melkite position for Arabic language promotion in catechism was very important, and it's a very important element of identification in this Catholic Eastern community. But what we do know is that in many parishes in Galilee at that time, people were mastering quite well French because many pilgrims were going there and they were able to have very decent conversation. We also have a lot of memoir from these people quoting the name of the family. And with these family names, we know that many of them were not elite. So, I mean, quoting Leo Halperin, Jerusalem is a Babel, you know, but it's not only a Babel in Zion with all this rich linguistic history for Jewish population. We can also try to make a portrait of the linguistic situation for Christian and Muslim population. So Palestinians were multilingual. What we cannot say for sure is to what extent. And we have far less archives, of course, than in the case of some of the Jewish groups.
From languages to religious institutions, the gap seems very large, but effectively it's not, because obviously most of the religious institutions in Palestine and Jerusalem were and are run by foreigners. And while we talked with a previous guest, Maria Chiara Rioli, about the Latin Patriarchate of Jerusalem and sort of a Latin presence in the city and Palestine, I would like to ask you something more about the Arab Christians, in particular Arab Catholics, since that's been the focus of your most recent work. Who are Arab Catholics in Palestine? Who are Arab Catholics in Jerusalem?
Very generally, Arab Catholics in Palestine are either Latin Catholic or Melkites, or what we say Greek Catholics. These are the two main communities. You do have a little bit of Maronite, but if we take these two big communities, Latin and Melkites, we are speaking about around between 10 and 15% of some of the neighborhood, for example. Why these two communities and not the other ones? That's a very long question, and I don't think I can answer quickly to that, but mainly the Latin were very, very few until 1847, when the Vatican decided to reinstall a Latin patriarchate. And I guess at some point you might invite Paolo Pieraccini in this podcast, because he wrote this book on how did the Vatican manage to install this Latin patriarchate, a direct concurrent of the Custodia di Terra Santa. This is the other institution. So Custodia di Terra Santa, as you know better than anyone else, had some schools. And so you have a tiny community of Latin Catholics who are not part of the elite. But after the Latin Patriarchate is established in Jerusalem, then you have a new type of Catholic elite. I don't know, I'm thinking, for example, of the family of the Alonso. These people are, for most of them, multilingual. And so you have a Catholic institution trying on one side to guarantee these type of elite that they can be reproduced within, you know, the channel that you find anywhere else in the Middle East at that time. And then you have a very poor Catholic population that is also mainly enrolled in missionary schools, with two completely different type of education proposed, different levels in languages. Now, there is a huge gap from a language point of view, but also many identification element, cultural one, and soon national ones. It's the Greek Catholic community. So I cannot explain, you know, the roots. 1724, these Greek joined the Roman Catholicism. So we call them uniats. But what is important for our period is that they are not located in the same place in Palestine. So they are mainly in Galilee and on the coastal zone. And these Melkites are promoting Arabic very much. And so the clergy of the Melkite church jump into the promotion of Arab Palestinian nationalism very early on. So that's probably a big difference between these two Catholic communities. For these two communities, they are part of one group for the Vatican, and these are the Catholics of the Holy Land. So early on in 1917, the Vatican has a policy trying to target on one part, but also answer to, well, many questions these Christians have for the Holy See. And so the Vatican is creating two specific institutions for Oriental congregation within the Vatican to try to answer to these specific Christian communities. So for example, should French or Italian stay the language of catechism, or is Arabic the language of God? Is it possible? So you have a series of debates because of course they are arguing that no, Arabic is not only linked to Islam, but it's also linked to the roots of Christianity. So it's not possible to continue to have catechism in French or Italian. So via all these type of archives, we see a very vivid community. And these Arab Palestinian Catholics are very much a transnational community as well. And by transnational, we mean, of course, there is Palestinian Arab Christian in Europe at that time, in the Americas, both North and South. Jacob Norris worked a lot on that, but there is also a lot of movement with the French mandate areas, so today Lebanon and Syria. And so, for example, you have a Melkite community in Galilee looking into the south of Lebanon much more than to Jaffa. So when we envisage these communities, we shouldn't make the mistake to think them within the borders after 48. Of course, with the British mandate and the French mandate, this crossing of the borders at times can become very challenging for these communities, but it's obvious that there is a constant flow between British mandate Palestine, French mandate Lebanon, and people spend their time, in summer in Saida or Beirut, come back to live near Haifa. Everyone knows, for example, Akrat Birit, next to the border. So these Christians are very connected, and not only for economic reasons and purposes, because they are involved in trade or tourism, but also because they are living across these borders at that time.
I'm very curious about the question of European missionaries, because you earlier mentioned this language diplomacy. And we can see, like, for instance, with the Vatican, that they began to establish some sort of a religious diplomacy, reopening the Latin Patriarchate, supporting to an extent the Melkite community, even though there were certainly internal conflict between the various groups. And I was wondering, what's the role of European missionaries, and particularly of Catholics around Palestine and Jerusalem, compared, for instance, to Lebanon and Syria?
I think the first element is there's no homogeneity. These European missionaries are, French, German, Austrian, Spanish, Italian. They and they do not evolve the same way during the whole mandate. So it's a very heterogeneous group. Some are challenging, the concept of the Holy Land much further than others. So if we take only schools, I think the second element is to be fair with this heterogeneity, but also to try to envisage the relational history of these missionaries. For several years, I think the missionary history was mainly, written via missionary archives. Of course, that's over, at least not for apologetic, academic approach. But the problem with that was that you only see one aspect of these missionaries, and we all know that they were asking for money. They were arguing that they converted because of economic reason, because of religious reason. So now what is interesting, and there are many colleagues who are working on that, is to have this relational approach and to see how, for example, they position themselves towards Arab nationalism. They were enrolling many students. Were they pro, I don't know, if we take the Collège des Frères French during the whole period, did they think they will convert some of the Muslim pupils? So these are the questions that come up when you try to compare local, Arabic sources in Arabic about how they were viewed and how they promote themselves in very specific type of archives, but also memoir. And we have quite a lot. And these are opening up. And then you see people evolving in how they qualify even, events or riots or Arabs or Arab Palestinians. So there is a whole change in the qualification. There is also a way of thinking about this territory. There is also a way of qualifying the notion, for example, of development or Eastern Christianity or religious landscape that is an Arab / Holy Land / Palestinian landscape. So some of the missionaries, well, you know that because you wrote an article, some of these elite missionary like Jussen, a Dominican father, had, well, it was not ambiguous. I mean, they were working for French government. So some of them were, for example, spying during First World War. But then during the period, the interwar period, we see many of them getting quite interested by the society they are involved with, phenomenon around them, acknowledging a certain identification that would be specific to this land, and at the same time, still having, some of the approach of the beginning of the 20th century about what is an Arab, what education can bring to these societies. So it's a very, I would say, complex image of these missionaries, and also a deep interest that is going beyond a colonial agent, some do indeed embody the cultural colonial agent elements in many aspects. Others are going beyond that. And then, of course, the real question is, and you see them struggling with that, the loyalty towards a nation, the loyalty towards the Holy See, but also, and we are dealing only with Catholic missionaries now, but also the loyalty to this, they don't say society, but communities, Arab communities they are serving. Very few of them are close to Jewish population, but some are. So that's also very interesting. If we take the Sisters of Zion, for example, the order was, created by two Jewish brothers, the brothers of Ratisbon, and then you see many debates to what extent they have to continue to aim to convert Jews. How do they manage between a more philanthropic approach to these Jews who are coming, or a more religious one? There are many discussions going on within these European missionaries. It's a very difficult question. I think I didn't answer fully, in the sense that I think the approach is a kind of global micro history. Doing some anthropology about these missionaries from an historical perspective is the only way to allow us to understand fully how they were functioning and how they evolved, in this very tiny Jerusalem environment, and at the same time, a very international environment, of course. So the notion of missionary agency is something important. And then there is a big question of their interaction. Of course, this is probably the most fascinating one, with the local population. And there as well, we see a very heterogeneous group of answers to many phenomena. And if we take probably a very sensitive one, on top of nationalism and the position of the Holy See, is also the girls' education, for example. They are not at ease with that. The concurrence of Protestant missionaries is fierce concerning the girls' education, multilingualism, but at the same time, it's fascinating to see that these Catholic missionaries also were directly involved, whether they liked it or not at that time, into the birth of a very local Catholic order, the Rosary Sisters. So the Rosary Sisters are Palestinian, Arab, Catholic, who are getting out of the Saint Joseph of the Apparition French Catholic order to tackle Palestinian Arab needs and to propose an education that would correspond more to this Palestinian Catholicism, to put the Arabic language at the heart of their education. And this is also part of the missionaries, because most of them are sent to France for their religious education, and then before they become sister, they are fighting within these Holy See environment up to the Vatican, arguing that they want to be respected as Palestinian Arab Catholic women, giving an education to Arab girls. So there is a colonial agenda as well from, for example, the Vatican side, and a very strong agency from these women trying to promote their Arab Catholicism in Palestine for Palestinians, using, of course, all the administrative and religious apparatus in order to be recognized.
And I think that eventually this process, particularly talking about women and girls, reached sort of a top when Pope Francis, just a few years back, canonized these two Palestinian nuns.
Yeah, Alphonsine, yeah.
Exactly, Alphonsine Gattas and Mariam Bawardi, right? If I remember right, the names.
Correct. Yeah,
who lived, in Ottoman ruled Palestine across this period of time. So I think it was obviously a long process, but one that brought eventually results also for the local community to be acknowledged beyond just being part of a picture of Jerusalem, but being active agents of that particular church. And there's another part of what you were saying that it's fascinating, and I think a lot of listeners may be familiar with, but also many may not, that in fact, when we talk about Catholics in Palestine and Jerusalem, this is such a diverse community that it's very hard to define, because essentially you have nationalities, and the example of the custody of the Holy Land is a good one, where all of nationalities are represented in that institution, and also of local constituents. And I guess you were right to start this discussion about what about the local Arabs? How do they relate to, sort of the other Catholics coming over? Which brings into the question of cultural diplomacy. You co-authored this very important book about cultural diplomacy in Palestine, which includes a lot of articles and chapters about Jerusalem. And, when we think about diplomacy, obviously we think about one point of origin. And in this case, it's rather simple. It's mostly European countries, but there must be also the end point, which are the locals. And I was wondering to what extent cultural diplomacy worked or not, looking at local Palestinian and Jerusalemites.
I think that was really the first question we had in mind when we started to organize conference in Leiden. And it's not, without reason that the first part of our book is about this, I would say, production and appropriation of cultural diplomacy by Arab Palestinian. And I think, I don't remember the exact title, but Sarah signed the introduction of the first part, and it's Indigenizing cultural diplomacy with a question mark. So, yeah, the question is fundamental and absolutely logical. When we speak about cultural diplomacy in the paradigm of relational history, of course, we want to know the other part of the question. You are absolutely right. So is there something like that? Yes. I mean, the volume was very clear about that, but how can we tackle that? There would be many elements, but because there's not one definition of cultural diplomacy, the way to use more diplomatic channel, whether they are, linguistic, cultural, political, economic, with a political goal at the end, is something absolutely clear for many elites, because now we are, of course, dealing with an elite phenomenon. And at that time, and more so during the 30s, there is a clear goal of, for example, promoting an idea of an Arab Holy Land, very clear in the mind of many actors. They also go as far as envisaging the modalities of this diplomacy. And well, many of them are multilingual, so they know how to adapt to certain audiences. The range of action are really important. I mean, Mizrahi talked, about a fair. There are many, many aspects. One of them is, of course, to go via trips to Europe and to promote via visits this Palestinian cause, if we speak about the 30s and Palestinian Arab nationalism. But there's not only this aspect, but this aspect, for example, is extremely important. And so when you have, Gregorius Adjar going from one city to another city in France, adapting his speeches to different audiences, knowing, presenting a certain aspect of these so-called Holy Lands, you do have a cultural diplomacy in the sense that they understand this will be very efficient. And then going back to Palestine, they also have a sense of the modalities on site, how to then react. But many face the problems we know in the political history of the 30s, of efficiency, etc., repression, occupation. So I would say cultural diplomacy is both an indigenous one and a European one, of course. If we just give one very clear example, this language cultural diplomacy would have never functioned if you don't have people wanting, to learn these languages, to make a language alive via literature, salon, exhibition, music concerts. And these communities, if you also take, the procession during the Palm Sundays, for example, in Jerusalem, then you also have a diplomacy. They know reporters from all over the world are there, and there is, like with Nabi Musa, as you showed also in this podcast, an agenda, a political agenda that is a diplomatic one, because they will not, for some of these Christian actors, if we take only those ones, acknowledge the journalists that this is a diplomacy towards this nationalism, but they are using all the channels and all the modalities to reach their goal. So in this sense, we thought it's an interesting concept to dig in. Yeah.
And it is indeed a fascinating concept, one that has a lot of different interpretations. I have questions about more the contemporary. I was wondering if you can see still a sort of a cultural diplomacy employed by the Catholic Church in Palestine and Jerusalem in the 21st century, and if so, how is it deployed and how does it work?
There are many elements coming to mind. The first element, probably the one I know the best from the archives, is the French one. Yes, it's a super active diplomacy. I think beyond, everything you saw about Chirac and Macron and their visit, their relation with the church. Okay, but from only an educational point of view, you have today Catholic agencies like, for example, Réseau Barnabé, who is in Saint-Germain-des-Prés, extremely active also financially to support. So I'm not a specialist, I'm just looking now with you into a more contemporary situation, but I did check also their action and I discussed with them. They have an agenda to support Christian communities. They have a definition, of this support that is very much inspired by some of the missionaries of the beginning of the century. So, for example, the notion of example within a more Muslim majority, how education can change on the ground the coexistence between Christian and Muslim, for example. This is one of their big aspects, but also how to develop education in rural Palestine. That's also part of their agenda. So you have a diplomacy that is active towards institutions within the Vatican, then national Catholic institution, for example, in France. And you also have a lot of movement between Palestinian communities and, well, if we take the case of France today, within this type of action. So inviting young Palestinians to spend the summer in France, coming regularly for Christmas, maintaining the idea that Christmas should be celebrated in spite of occupation in Bethlehem. So there is a lot going on, but financially, we are not speaking about massive action, no. But this is continuously done since, in fact, since the creation of the State of Israel. And lately, they are affiliating themselves with certain branch of Catholicism in France. And so there is a kind of, I would say, revival of interventionism in Palestine. So Palestine is, for a certain type of French Catholicism, a land of mission, we can say. It's much more complicated, of course, than that. And there is a lot of different colors in this type of expression. But it's very vivid, that's for sure. And if we look into missionaries we evoked, for example, in this podcast, if we take the Dominican, a father of the École Biblique, well, Réseau Barnabé, for example, is also active promoting all the photothèques, so the old photos of the École Biblique recently by the father Jean-Michel de Tarragon. And so they distribute in France several volumes of these photos. They organize exhibition, and their agenda is both turned towards Catholic institution on site in Jerusalem and Israel for Nazareth, for example, and Palestine, but also in France. If you look into how they are very active in certain regions more than others, by the way, like in Bretagne. So you have, for example, this diplomacy is the photos of the beginning of the century and the 20s. Lately, they had an exhibition on education and nationalism during the mandate that they exposed in several churches in France so that people could be aware of the situation while they go to church. So it's a kind of religious diplomacy and educational diplomacy in that sense, I think, yeah. But I'm not a specialist.
You may not be a specialist, but I wanted to ask you about pictures and imaging, because in recent time you published a number of works dedicated to imaging, so sort of an image of Palestine, but also imagining Palestine. I was wondering to what extent and what is the role of photography, again, filling the gap between languages and cultural diplomacy. Is photography just a way of selling Palestine, or there's something more linked to it?
I will answer as an historian because I will remain an historian. So I am not versed into tackling photography as, you know, people, wonderful colleagues like Ariela Azoulay or Sari Zataniri. Not at all. You know, I'm much more at ease with textual archives. But I was always fascinated by photography, I think because I started in Hebron with a big problem of preserving these photographies in the Waqf archives. And for me, it was like an initiatic trip within these Waqf archives in Hebron. How do you access them? Why photography is much more dangerous, I was told, than text, you know. So there was a whole logic of approaching that. And I think the last years, I was obsessed by first the question of preservation and then the question of who is behind these photographies. So working with Norig Neveu and Jean-Michel de Tarragon, for example, lately, I was wondering, how did they perceive the society around them, these Dominicans? And beyond, you know, being a selling point, of course they were, there would be much to say about the evolution during the 30 years, of the interwar period on what we can see and how photographers, and in my case, mainly missionary photographers, evolve. And so you see them, well, it's a bit, reductive, but at the beginning, they hardly see people around them. But at the end of the period, they are taking many photos about local festivals, teatries, recipes, political events, the big Arab revolts around their buildings. And the way they are taking this photograph in a very spontaneous way, and then the way they preserve them, I think is telling us a lot about how looking at the Holy Land is evolving very much during the interwar period. So without being, too reductive, I think this is the main idea I took on from this photography analysis the last years.
I'm not an expert either, and I always enjoy listening to Sari, Sam Nassar, and others, because I think they really can offer a different kind of picture of Jerusalem and of Palestine through this material, which for many like myself is just a picture, and I'm very fascinated by some of the details, but it's the reading of what's behind that I think is very, very important. I have one last question, and it's very much about your upcoming book, Oriental Brothers, Arab Catholics, Languages, Identities in Palestine, 1918-1948. Can you give us a preview of your upcoming book?
Yep, I am still writing some parts of it, but the idea of Oriental Brothers started, I think, 5 years ago, before I was granted the project Crossroads, so I didn't get to finish it. But the idea is to focus on the complex relationship between language, religion, identity, and diplomacy. Here we are again, in this so-called Holy Land, but through the, I would say, repositioning of Arab Catholics. This is, my main entry at different scales. So micro, meso, and macro level. And so I started by thinking that, this language and cultural agenda, mainly in Jerusalem, is better known via the school. But in fact, these brothers, as the Vatican, because this is coming from an expression from the Vatican, negotiated very much their identification, their nationalism, and both at a regional and a transnational level. So I would say this book, I intend to consider first, the British mandate in Palestine as an internationalized node within a transnational framework. I mean, that's obvious from the Crossroad different publication. But I want to appreciate how, I would say, complex language and cultural interactions produced new modes of modernity that I will try to define in the book. And I think what was really appealing to me when I started with the idea of the book was to bring the study of language into the historical field. And I think it's coming from the fact that I worked with Wilhelm Freihof a lot lately with the collection Languages and Culture in History. But because, well, language, was a very poor topic in this cultural history, but we now have Babel in Zion from Liora Alperin, and also from an ideology about language point of view, following Ursula Schaffer. distinction. So I found myself with these Arab Catholics, a group that many call a minority, and I will try to define that, who remain, let's say, understudied when you go out of these religious studies and theology approaches. So I thought I want to tackle their various loyalty, linguistic battles, early cultural diplomacy. We just mentioned that, for example, and also their link with imperial debate and their communities of Arab Palestinians abroad. So I remain in this, I will try, in this relational history approach, but moving, beyond this lachrymose history of a golden past for Christian in the Holy Land, and also very, I think, simplistic approach and presentation of these Christian Catholics as mainly agent of cultural imperialism or of the Holy See. And I want to show, their transnational thought on Palestine as well, and how they were deeply rooted and caught up with several overlapping identification and loyalties. So I hope I will succeed to convey this message.
This was Karene Sanchez, Associate Professor at the University of Leiden and author of the upcoming book, Oriental Brothers, Arab Catholics, Languages, Identities in Palestine, 1918-1948. Karene, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Roberto.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to support the podcast, please share it with others on social media or leave a rating and review. To catch all the latest, follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook @Jerusalem Unplugged. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.